This video is my reaction and thoughts to the Warhammer Total War 3 video and announcement. Alright, we have this amazing new video of the forces of Kislev fighting off an army of Khorne, mortals, and demons. I've been a long-time fan of Warhammer Total War games, or rather Total War games in general, having played I think every single title since the franchise began in 2000, about 20 years ago. So it's always been a real pleasure for me that Creative Assembly kind of partnered with Games Workshop to combine two things that I really enjoyed. And I've played, quite a lot of Total War games. Usually, most of the time, somewhere around 1,000 hours or so per title. And I think I've played Total War games in general with every single faction on the hardest difficulty levels, and just had a lot of fun with this game. So the video here was really cool. They did a really good job. I don't know if it really stands out in my mind too much better than some of the previous videos, but it was good. Now, obviously, it doesn't tell you anything about the gameplay, but having played the first two Warhammer games, I'm not really too concerned here, right? I know how these games work. It will be good. I mean, with some of the more recent patches, Warhammer 2 is in its best place at this point, probably. And the game's campaign system in general is just really phenomenal. So I'm not expecting massive changes in terms of the gameplay and mechanics here. It's going to be a Total War game in an environment that I like, and a kind of a narrative I like to explore. So I'm good. So long as they push the envelope slightly here, a little more space, a couple new factions, I'll be really happy. So we knew this was coming. This was a long-planned a trilogy of games, and many of the elements were anticipated for years. Last couple years I've been Googling Warhammer Total War 3, and everyone seemed to be indicating that demons were something that would be expected. And given the kind of designed and expanding space of the first two games, it was just long assumed that the Total War games would have these types of elements and armies and expand the map eastward. All of which has now been absolutely confirmed. So this game will have demons, and it does look like Nurgle and Tzeentch and Slaanesh and Khorne will all be represented. For each of these games there's been kind of a core narrative campaign. And for Warhammer 3, this appears to be centered around Kislev and Cathay fighting off an incursion of demons. Now, I personally tend to focus more on the Mortal Empires style of gameplay. Big map, multiple factions. I actually don't play any of the narrative campaigns that much. And so I'm really excited for the fact that, the old Total War 2 had like 300 plus places that you could capture and occupy, and now it will likely be far, far larger. Lots of towns, lots of capitals. Cathay is far away from the Empire, so we're looking at possible geographical expansion here as large as between that of Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 that included High Elves and Dark Elves and Lizard Men and Tomb Kings. So an enormous expansion from the first game to the second, and I'm really anticipating a similar size here to the third. And I love the idea of having this kind of enormous amount of space to play, and probably fairly unusual in that I like the idea of very long campaigns that have the potential to lose, depending on how things go on the other side of the world. So, an idea of playing 30 or 40 hours and then deciding, the odds are against me here, and restarting. That's what I do all the time. I'm constantly restarting new campaigns. But, there's so much to love here. And perhaps the best part of playing these types of games is their genuine randomness. Right? You can never tell which factions will be dominant or which will be wiped out early on. And I've just seen so many crazy events happen in the game. You know, Empire orcs just get absolutely massive and are unstoppable, or vice versa. They just get wiped out. And I love that randomness. You can never bank on anything in these games. It's completely random for who will actually come out on top. And I like that. You know, it's not cookie cutter type of style gameplay where you know the AI will always do this or always do that. And that adds some variety. And so the larger map, you know, between the Empire and Cathay here, there's room to expand, right? We know Ogre Kingdoms are in that gap. We know Chaos Dwarves are there. They could be added here. We know at the very beginning there's going to be a race pack DLC that will include some unknown number of races. Basically, I'm expecting everything from Warhammer Total War 2, including all the DLC content to some extent. And then we'll see what else gets added in here. But, you know, the more the better. So Games Workshop is working to relaunch the Warhammer Fantasy line miniature game in some fashion with Warhammer Old World as the working title. And the details here are fairly limited, right? We don't know quite what this game looks like or when it will be coming out. But it's very clear to me that Total War games have long been kind of an engine to keeping the dreams of Warhammer Fantasy alive. The success of the game could always be referenced as the success of the IP, despite the transition to Age of Sigmar, right? So Warhammer Total War is doing great. It's selling tons of copies. Lots of people are playing it. Vibrant community on YouTube and elsewhere. People can always point to that and say, well, look, people like fantasy. And it just seems clear to me that the development at this point of Total War and Old World are fairly paralleled, right? There's lots of concept art going back and forth between the two, and we know Old World is probably still a few years out at least, but Total War will still be a thing when it does come out. And so let's dive a little bit into kind of Kislev and Cathay, because that's at least the first initial striking characteristics of this game. So Kislev was an existing but kind of unplayable faction in the previous years. So even in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, Kislev was a fairly minor faction, even when it had its own army. Really only kind of a handful of units that really disappeared long ago at this point. And because of its geographical location, it was always the first to be destroyed by the Chaos invasions. And you saw that play in the game too, where Kislev was quite frequently wiped out. And I always think about kind of that amazing artwork by Adrian Smith of a Chaos War triumphant after the destruction of Prague. And that is literally the official title of this artwork. And, just traditionally there is no future in the Warhammer world that is 1 second from midnight where Kislev survives. It was just always expected that this was a nation that you could play some games with in the game on the tabletop, but let's face it, narratively, this nation is going to get wiped out here soon enough. The Empire, at least, it was like a buffer for the Empire, right? The Empire could be destroyed too, and it eventually was, of course, in the end times, but, Kislev would always fall first. Poor old Kislev. So the fact that they're placing so much emphasis in the video and in the narrative here is an interesting choice. Probably in anticipation of and to developing Old World, and we know that there's a lot of sketching out of art and concepts concerning Kislev surrounding the Old World. And this could mean that Kislev is an important part of the game. And it's also just potentially kind of the Old World for me, that it raises so many questions, right? Both projects seem far more ambitious in their scope than I would have expected. Like, I don't know how much of a narrative you can really have about Kislev. And if Kislev is playing a reasonably large factor in Old World, that raises so many possibilities for me. Now, Cathay in particular is a blank slate. It was on the maps for the Old World. There were hints and teases throughout Warhammer Fantasy, but let's face it, nothing was ever fully fleshed out. So there's kind of this enormous design space here where they can really explore and come up with something new. And they have actually said that there will be some surprises in terms of like the structure of the society. And I'm looking forward to see what those are. That should be fun. So again, whatever the Old World miniature game is or will be, it seems like it will also incorporate some Cathay influence or faction. And kind of the geography and culture of the Old World, as most people will know, mirrors that of the geography and culture of the real world rather closely. So some of those connections are a little cringy, right? Like Americans and Dark Elves, ogres and kind of Mongols, right? Some of them are not really nice parallels to make. But in this context, Cathay is basically China. And we're not sure if there will be Nippon, but that is kind of the Warhammer equivalent of Japan. But we're anticipating aesthetics surrounding kind of Eastern dragons and celestial warriors. Both Creative Assembly and perhaps Games Workshop are kind of gunning for the Chinese market here, we can assume. And I thought it was interesting that in the Creative Assembly Q&A about the game, there's a Q&A in English and then two different versions of Chinese. So there's just an enormous design space here. They're really gunning for it. We'll see what there is, what actually happens, how large of a faction it is, how flushed out it is. Again, this has never really been done, so it's interesting to see it go forth in a video game first, but I'm expecting this to be the tail end of the potential Old World relaunch as well. So a new Total War game could also mean kind of a rework of existing factions and campaigns like Beastmen. Personally, I never thought that the mechanics of the Horde army really worked too well. These games tend to change dramatically from patch to patch. Kind of the Chaos Invasion is a really good example of this. You know, initially the Chaos Invasion is the biggest existential threat that you could possibly face in the game. And in the first Warhammer game, oh my goodness, was it bad when it showed up. And there are definitely some really bad times in Warhammer 2 if you're kind of caught unaware by this thing. But then some of the patch changes occurred, and a lot of the kind of NPC factions just became much more dominant, a little more stronger, and the Chaos would show up and they just get annihilated. So the amazing differences in patches here really can change the gameplay quite dramatically. But what that means is that they're willing to fix things, they're willing to perfect things. You know, one of the biggest changes they made is the speed in which it scrolls through different factions. That was dramatically increased, and that really speed up gameplay. But now clearly I'm interested in the game. This is something I really do want to play. I'm very interested in it. But I also want to kind of balance my gameplay with painting and other hobby projects. I've talked before on this channel about how do I balance video games and how do I make this work such that I can enjoy these things and also get finished on the hobby projects I want, because you know, like I said, I can easily spend 1,000 hours or more in this game. I might need to implement some parental controls here to kind of work it through it, but I have work to do in the hobby. And I know this game will be around for years to come, so I hope to play it, but in a little more of a moderate fashion. So, now that the trilogy that Creative Assembly is signed on for is complete, what does the future really hold? Right? I know some people want Creative Assembly to revisit some of their earlier historical titles, like Medieval, and kind of do a Medieval 3. You know, I would love that. I think that'd be really cool. It's not Warhammer related, but man, Medieval 2 was a great game. But part of me also wants them to re-sign a different contract and to forge ahead into Age of Sigmar. So we'll see. Time will tell. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Please consider supporting the channel by commenting on the video, hitting that little like button, and subscribing for more Warhammer content.